Sacramento's upscale neighborhood gleamed beautifully in the evening sun. Margaret Winslow gazed out through the large living room window, waiting for her husband to come home. After 12 years of marriage, she had supported their household as a full-time homemaker. But recently, a faint shadow had begun to fall over this quiet home. Margaret's husband, Robert, was a sales manager at a pharmaceutical company. Tall and handsome, he was known as a sociable man with a gift for conversation. In the early days of their marriage, Margaret had been attracted to his work ethic and personality, believing they could become the ideal couple. Indeed, friends often envied them as a perfect couple. The two had no children. For several years after their marriage, Margaret had continued fertility treatments, but 3 years ago she finally decided to give up. The doctors had diagnosed her with unexplained infertility, and despite trying various treatments, no results came. While Robert showed understanding on the surface, Margaret could sense his disappointment. Especially when he interacted with friends' children, there was something wistful in his expression. 5 years ago, Margaret's parents had passed away in succession. Her father died suddenly of a heart attack, and her mother followed 6 months later. Margaret inherited the real estate business her parents had run, along with the assets they had accumulated over many years. The inheritance was larger than expected, and Margaret and Robert's life changed completely. Moving to an upscale neighborhood, purchasing a new car, and taking overseas trips several times a year. Financial worries disappeared, but at the same time, Margaret began to think about her own sense of worth. Recently, Robert's late homecomings had become more frequent. While Robert repeatedly explained that he was busy with a new project, Margaret was beginning to have doubts. Previously, he would always contact her in advance, but lately he would just send brief messages saying, "I'll be late tonight." He had also started checking his cell phone more frequently, and sometimes would take long phone calls in another room. Margaret had been consulting with her best friend Lisa about these changes. Lisa worked as a marriage counselor and had experience with many couples' relationships. She gently suggested it might be a 12-year marriage crisis, but deep in Margaret's heart, anxiety was growing that there might be something more serious. When Robert came home, he would act bright and cheerful as usual. Sharing dinner while discussing work and weekend plans, they appeared to be a couple with no problems at all. However, Margaret noticed that his gaze would sometimes become vacant, as if his mind were elsewhere, thinking about something else. At night, lying in bed, Margaret would stare at the ceiling. Listening to Robert's quiet breathing as he slept beside her, she thought about their married life. They had married for love, but perhaps their inability to have children, losing her parents, and the change in their financial situation had gradually affected their relationship. With the arrival of spring, the anxiety in Margaret's heart grew day by day. Robert's late homecomings had become routine, and even on weekends he would go out more frequently, claiming emergency meetings. One morning, Margaret was drinking coffee while watching Robert hurriedly finish his breakfast. When his cell phone rang, Robert quickly checked the screen and immediately placed the phone face down. Previously, he would never hide who was calling. Rather, if it was a work call, he would explain, "It's from the company," and sometimes even share the content of the conversation. "Who was that call from?" Margaret asked casually, and Robert froze for a moment. "Oh, a new client. We're still working out the details, so there's not much I can talk about." His answer had become more vague than before.
Can you imagine making $10,000 a month just from YouTube, all from home? That's exactly what I did with Reddit Stories. No face, no voice. Check the link in the description if you're curious.
Margaret didn't press further, but a small alarm bell began ringing in her heart. Robert had always been someone who spoke about work in detail. He would often talk with sparkling eyes about the excitement of new projects and challenges with difficult cases. But recently, he had started avoiding work conversations. At the end of each month, Margaret had the habit of checking credit card statements to manage household finances. However, since last month, Robert had said, "I'll manage them so they don't get mixed up with company cards," and stopped showing her the statements. Since their marriage, they had managed household finances transparently. Neither had ever hidden expenses from the other. It seems like expenses have increased lately. "Did you make any large purchases?" Margaret asked one day, and Robert showed a slightly irritated expression. "There are a lot of work-related entertainment expenses. It's none of your concern." Margaret was surprised by this response. In their married life, this was the first time she had heard the words, "none of your concern," from him. A couple's assets were shared property, and they had jointly managed everything, especially including the assets she had inherited from her parents. While having lunch with her best friend Lisa, Margaret consulted about her husband's changes. Lisa had seen various couples' problems through her experience as a marriage counselor. "Margaret, there's actually something that's been bothering me," Lisa began, carefully choosing her words. "Last week, when I went on a business trip to Fresno." Fresno was a city about 2.5 hours south of Sacramento. Margaret couldn't think of any reason for Robert to go there. "I saw Robert. At first I thought it might be someone else, but it was definitely him. But he wasn't alone." Margaret's heart pounded. "Who was he with?" "A woman. Blonde, seemed a bit younger than you. They were talking very intimately." Lisa hesitated. "Maybe she was a colleague, or maybe I was mistaken. But I thought I should let you know, just in case." That evening, while preparing dinner, Margaret mulled over Lisa's words. Robert did go on business trips to Fresno, but recently the frequency had increased. And he no longer talked about the details of his trips as much as before. When Robert came home, Margaret asked while trying to appear calm, "You've had a lot of business trips to Fresno lately?" "Yes, there's a new client there," Robert answered naturally, but to Margaret, his expression seemed to tense for a moment. A few days later, Robert suddenly proposed something unexpected, a driving trip for just the two of them after a long time. "We've been so busy lately that we haven't had time together. How about we go on a drive somewhere far this weekend?" Margaret was surprised. Recently, he had been prioritizing work over family time, so she hadn't expected such a proposal to come suddenly. "Where would we go?" "How about Las Vegas? Let's have a luxurious weekend for once." Robert had never suggested a trip to Las Vegas except for wedding anniversaries. Moreover, it was a sudden proposal just 3 days before departure. While Margaret was puzzled, she thought this might be an opportunity to repair their marriage, so she accepted the proposal. The day before departure, Robert presented Margaret with an expensive diamond necklace. When she received the small Tiffany box, Margaret felt conflicted. "Why such an expensive gift?" "Because you've always had to put up with so much. It's a token of my gratitude." Robert's words were kind, but Margaret felt something was off. That night, Robert unusually came to the bedroom early and said while embracing Margaret, "I love you. I want you to remember that above all." These words confused Margaret. They sounded like farewell words. Though they were words of love, they somehow had a tone that made her feel anxious. The next morning, while preparing for departure, Margaret looked at herself in the mirror. The new necklace sparkled at her throat, but somehow it felt heavy. Her husband's kindness was actually amplifying her anxiety. When Robert started the car engine and asked, "Are you ready?" Margaret smiled and answered. However, deep in her heart, the conviction that something was wrong was growing stronger. Still, she hoped this trip would restore their relationship. The journey to Las Vegas went smoothly. California's dry landscape flowed past the car window, and the morning sun illuminated the desert rock faces. Margaret sat in the passenger seat listening to music, trying to enjoy their first couple's trip in a long time. However, she noticed that Robert seemed somehow restless. Even while driving, he frequently checked the rearview mirror and showed nervous reactions whenever his cell phone rang. When Margaret tried to talk to him, he would often respond absent-mindedly. She got the impression that he was being pursued by something. "Are you tired? Shall I take over driving?" Margaret suggested, and Robert quickly shook his head. "No, I'm fine. We can rest soon." Around 2 p.m., near the state border in a small town, Robert noticed the fuel gauge needle was low and stopped at an old gas station. A sign reading, "Desert Stop," swayed in the wind, a typical rural gas station. It had an attached convenience store, and several cars were stopped for fuel. As soon as Robert turned off the engine, a young male employee approached. His name tag read, Jake. With a sincere expression on his tanned face and wearing work clothes, he gave the impression of a typical small-town young man. "Fill it up, please," Robert said, rolling down the window, and Jake replied, "Certainly," and began fueling. Margaret was drinking bottled water in the car while casually watching Jake fuel up. Then she noticed him doing something near the fuel opening. He looked toward Margaret and quietly slipped a small folded piece of paper into the gap by her window. Margaret was surprised. Jake continued fueling while making eye contact with her and shaking his head slightly. It was like a signal saying, "Don't open it now." "How long until we arrive?" Robert asked Jake. "To Las Vegas, about 3 more hours, sir." "Road conditions are good," Jake answered naturally, but to Margaret, his voice sounded a bit tense. After fueling was complete, Robert paid with his credit card. After Jake moved away from the car, Margaret quietly took out the piece of paper. Written in shaky handwriting were just the words, "Run away now." Margaret's heart pounded violently. She didn't understand the meaning. Why would a stranger give her such a note? Was it a prank, or was there some serious reason? "What's wrong?" Robert noticed her condition and asked. Margaret instinctively hid the note in her hand. "I'm going to the restroom." "There's no need to hurry. We have plenty of time." Robert's words seemed to contain something like relief. Margaret got out of the car and headed toward the convenience store. Following the restroom signs to the back of the building, she found Jake waiting. His expression was far more serious than before. "I'm sorry for doing this so suddenly," Jake began speaking in a low voice. "But I couldn't stay silent." "What are you talking about? Is there some problem with us?" Margaret was confused. Jake looked around before continuing. "There's something I need to tell you about your husband. 3 weeks ago, he came here with another woman." Margaret's blood drained. Lisa's story flashed through her mind. They were talking quite intimately during fueling. "But I wouldn't have said anything if that's all it was," Jake paused. "The problem is that he called that woman his real wife." Margaret felt her knees shaking. "Real wife?" "Yes." "I couldn't help overhearing their conversation during fueling. When the woman asked, 'What about her?' your husband answered, 'Don't worry. I'll take care of everything on this trip.'" "Take care of everything? What does that mean?" Jake's expression became even darker. "This morning, I overheard them talking on the phone again. Your husband said, 'Everything will be over today. Starting tomorrow I'll be free. And then, all the procedures to put her in a mental hospital are arranged.'" Margaret felt dizzy. Mental hospital? Why would they need to put her in a mental hospital? "Please tell me more details," Margaret asked in a trembling voice. "They seem to have consulted with a doctor beforehand and made plans to forcibly hospitalize you with a diagnosis of being mentally unstable. That way they could freely manage your assets," they were saying. Everything connected. The large inheritance from her parents, her husband's recent kindness, the expensive presents, and this suddenly proposed trip. It was all part of a plan. But why are you warning me? Margaret asked. Jake showed a sad expression. My mother went through something similar. She was deceived by my stepfather and had all her assets stolen. At that time, no one helped her. So this time, I wanted to help. Margaret took a deep breath. She needed to organize the situation. What should I do now? Why don't you escape in my car? I'll take you to the nearest police station. If you explain everything there, they'll surely help you. Margaret hesitated. If Jake's story was true, returning to Robert would be tantamount to suicide. But if it was wrong, she would ruin 12 years of married life. Just then, footsteps could be heard from the direction of the convenience store. Margaret! Where are you? It was Robert's voice. His voice had a coldness she had never heard before. Jake said urgently, "You need to decide. This is your only chance." In that instant, Margaret reflected on their entire married life. Her husband's recent changes, her friend's sighting, and the terrifying plan she had just heard. The moment she was convinced it was all true, she made her decision. "Please. Take me away." Jake nodded and headed toward an old blue pickup truck parked in the corner of the parking lot. Margaret followed him without looking back. As the engine started, Robert appeared around the corner of the building. Seeing his wife get into a stranger's car, his face changed color. "Margaret! What are you doing?" But it was too late. Jake's truck raised dust as it pulled onto the road and drove away in the opposite direction. When Margaret looked back, she could see Robert running toward their white sedan. His expression showed not the concern of a husband worried about his beloved wife, but the panic and anger of a man whose plan had gone awry. Jake's pickup truck continued driving along the desert road. Margaret sat in the passenger seat trembling, trying to understand what had happened to her. After driving for about 30 minutes, Jake stopped the car at the local police station. "Tell them everything here. They'll surely help you," Jake said gently. At the police station, a female officer who listened to Margaret's story responded carefully. However, she explained that without concrete evidence, they couldn't immediately arrest her husband. Instead, she recommended applying for a temporary protective order to ensure her safety. "Please stay somewhere safe tonight. We'll begin a detailed investigation tomorrow morning," the officer said with a serious expression. Margaret immediately called her best friend Lisa. When she explained the situation, Lisa instantly answered, "Come to my house right away." Jake kindly offered to drive her to Lisa's house. When they arrived at Lisa's house, it was already late at night. Lisa was waiting at the front door and hugged Margaret tightly. "I'm so glad you're safe," Lisa's voice was trembling. "Ever since I saw him in Fresno, I thought something was wrong." That night, Margaret couldn't sleep due to excitement and fear. Alone in Lisa's guest room, she reflected on their married life. It was difficult to accept the reality that the husband she believed she loved was actually a fraudster who had approached her for her assets. The next morning, Lisa introduced her to a competent private investigator. David Clark, a man who specialized in marriage fraud and bigamy cases. "From what I've heard, this is a typical pattern of marriage fraud," Clark explained in a calm voice. "First, let's start with an identity investigation of your husband. We need to examine his real name, past marriage history, and current living situation in detail." 3 days after the investigation began, Clark had shocking news. In Lisa's living room, Margaret heard an unbelievable truth. The name Robert Winslow was false. His real name is Robert Jenkins. And he's had another family in Phoenix, Arizona for 10 years. Margaret was speechless. 10 years ago was 2 years after their marriage. The woman is Jennifer Jenkins. He has 8-year-old twins with her. Legally, Since your marriage came first, his actions constitute bigamy. Clark showed her photographs. There was Robert with a blonde woman and 2 children. It was a picture of a happy family. Margaret understood that there was Robert's real life that she knew nothing about. Further investigation revealed even more serious facts, Clark continued. Robert and Jennifer were conspiring to forcibly hospitalize you in a mental institution. Margaret's hands trembled. Jake's story had been completely true. They had bribed a doctor and created false medical records to diagnose you with delusional disorder. Once you were hospitalized, they could use the guardianship system to manage your assets. So my inheritance was their goal, Margaret asked in a trembling voice. Exactly. After your parents passed away, their plan became concrete. The Las Vegas trip was meant to be the final touch to make you mentally unstable. Margaret's body shook with anger. For 12 years, the man she had loved and trusted was actually a cold-hearted fraudster. And without the courage of a stranger, she might now be drugged in a mental hospital. What should I do going forward? Margaret asked. First, you need to hire an excellent lawyer. We should organize evidence of bigamy, fraud, and psychological abuse, and proceed with both criminal charges and civil litigation. Through Clark's introduction, Margaret met with Elizabeth Hartwell, a female lawyer specializing in family law. She was an experienced attorney who had handled many similar cases. Your case is extremely malicious, Hartwell said with indignation. However, we have sufficient evidence. If we take the initiative, we can definitely win. That evening, Margaret visited the police station and formally filed a complaint. An investigation into Robert began on suspicion of bigamy, fraud, and psychological abuse. At the same time, she applied for a restraining order to ensure her personal safety. The following week, Margaret visited the bank and froze all jointly named accounts. She took legal measures to prevent Robert from accessing her assets. She also took protective measures for the real estate inherited from her parents through her lawyer. Your swift response paid off, Hartwell reported later. Robert hastily hired a lawyer, but the evidence is so clear that there's no room for defense. A few days later, more good news arrived. Arizona state prosecutors had also begun an investigation, and Jennifer was expected to be charged as a co-conspirator. It was discovered that she too had knowingly and actively cooperated in Robert's fraudulent activities. Margaret sat on Lisa's veranda watching the sunset, thinking. Just a week ago, she thought she was living a happy married life. But it had all been a skillfully created illusion. Her cell phone rang with a text message from Jake. How are you doing? If there's anything I can help with, please contact me anytime. Margaret smiled as she replied. Thanks to you, I can start a new life. Thank you so much. Outside the window, the California sunset was shining beautifully. For the first time, Margaret felt true hope. And she felt deep gratitude for the courage and kindness of a stranger that had saved her life. 1 year later, in the courtroom of Sacramento District Court, Margaret Winslow was experiencing a moment of victory. The judge's voice reading the final verdict echoed in the silent courtroom. I sentence defendant Robert Jenkins to 7 years in prison for bigamy and fraud. Margaret quietly held hands with her lawyer Elizabeth Hartwell sitting beside her. The long battle had finally ended. Looking back toward the rear of the courtroom, she could see her best friend Lisa smiling with tears in her eyes. As Robert was handcuffed, he never once looked in Margaret's direction. The figure of the man she once believed loved her was now nothing more than a stranger and criminal. Outside the courtroom, reporters were waiting. This case had been widely reported in local media and attracted attention as a typical example of marriage fraud. Margaret commented briefly. Through this experience, I learned that true family is not about blood relations or legal relationships, but about people connected by trust and honesty. In the simultaneous trial in Arizona, Jennifer Jenkins had been convicted of conspiracy. She too was sentenced to 3 years in prison. The twin children would be taken in by Jennifer's mother. Margaret felt complicated but worried about the future of the innocent children. 2 months after the trial ended, Margaret moved to a new home. She decided to leave the house that held memories with Robert and start a truly new life in a small town near San Francisco. Drinking morning coffee on the porch of her new home, Margaret was reading a message from Jake on her cell phone. Since that day, the two had been in regular contact. Jake had begun studying mechanical engineering at the local university and was working hard toward his future. "Inspired by your courage, I'm also taking on new challenges. My mother is happy too." Margaret smiled as she replied. "You're the one who saved my life. Please give my regards to your mother." A few days later, Margaret was visiting a community center in Sacramento. She had decided to start a new activity, volunteering with an organization that supports victims of marriage fraud and domestic violence. "I want to help people who have had similar experiences," Margaret explained to the organization's representative. "I was fortunate to have people who helped me, but I think there are many people suffering alone." At the first support group meeting, Margaret shared her experience. 5 women listened intently. After she finished speaking, one woman tearfully expressed her gratitude. "Hearing your story gave me hope. I've found the courage to start a new life too." That fall, Margaret received a special invitation. Along with news that Jake had graduated from university and found employment at a local company, she received an invitation to a dinner of gratitude. At a small restaurant, Jake welcomed Margaret along with his mother Dorothy. Dorothy had known about Margaret through her son's stories. "I'm so glad my son was able to help you," Dorothy said with moist eyes. "That boy has always been unable to leave troubled people alone." "I'm the one who was saved by Jake," Margaret answered from her heart. "He taught me what true family means." During dinner, the three talked about various things: Jake's future dreams, Dorothy's past struggles, and Margaret's new activities. Even without blood relations, there was a relationship bound by true bonds. On the way home, Margaret looked up at the night sky. The night of terror from a year ago seemed like a lie, and now she felt a hopeful future awaited her. At 36, Margaret had gained true freedom for the first time in her life. Liberated from a false marriage, she had found a way to live as herself. And she deeply understood the value of true human relationships that transcend blood relations and legal ties. A small act of courage that occurred at an unknown gas station had completely changed one woman's life. And now, that woman was trying to become a light for others suffering in the same way. Margaret's new chapter, having found the true meaning of life, was quietly beginning.